to the art of translation again. It is a tremendous honor, and I can't tell you quite how relieved I am to introduce Dr. Simon, who at 3 o'clock this afternoon was still waiting for her plane in Montreal, but who did manage to make it to Boston, and we managed to make it back here in time to see you. So I will keep my introductory remarks brief. As I just mentioned, so Dr. Simon is a professor of French at Concordia University in Montreal, in Canada. She has a great number of publications, but what I really want to emphasize so that everybody who's here tonight realizes just how important this is how much she has really defined and formed the field of translation studies, the field that we've been discussing in our lectures here this evening. I'll just mention 2 texts, Gender in Translation, which really brought gender into the field of translation at that point, which is a really critical piece on that subject, and really still remains one of the most important pieces. And also the work then from which you read the introduction, Cities in Translation, Intersections of Language and Memory. I think at this point, I'm not going to speak any longer because I really want you to hear from Dr. Simon. So please give her a really warm welcome. She has literally walked off the plane and into the class.
Well, thank you. This was very dramatic. And really, if it weren't for Carolyn, who jumped into her car and drove to Boston and picked me up, I wouldn't be here. So really, thank you so much for your generosity. So this makes it all the more exciting to be here. So I'll just launch right into this, and I think you'll get the gist. So this is probably going to be quite different from what other presenters have presented, but you'll find out. Examining photographs of the city of Czernowitz from the 1930s, Marion Hirsch and Leo Spitzer try to imagine which language the men and women are speaking as they stride confidently down the main street. Is this actually is this a mic? Yes. All right, I'm going to use it because that's good. Okay. So what language, but it's far away. Okay. Which language the men and women are speaking as they stride confidently down the main street? Would it have been Romanian, the language of the nation which took over the city in 1918? Or German, the language of the former Habsburg rulers? Or Yiddish, the language spoken by many of the city's Jewish population? Or Polish, the language of another significant minority? The city was renowned for its exuberant mixture of languages. Even the tourist brochures made note of it. And here, a comic strip. But by the time the authors accompanied their parents, I'll just go back to that, in 1998 on a first return visit to the city since the Second World War, they heard only one language, Ukrainian. The linguistic hodgepodge of store signs, shop names, placards, and advertising billboards was gone. The Café de l'Europe and the Café Habsburg had become ghostly presences in a city where informal trade and barter among Ukrainians were the most prevalent forms of commerce. Although the built environment of the city was largely the same, the meaning and function of the urban spaces had been transformed. The links that gave meaning to these places, the ties that made sense of them as replicas of the street names and street patterns of Vienna, had been severed. First, the Herrengasse became the Romanian Strada Iancu Flondor. Then, after the Second World War, the Herrengasse was renamed for the Ukrainian writer Olha Kubilanska. The fact that returning visitors like Marion Hirsch's parents continued to refer to the city's street names in German underlined the fact that the city for them remained a mental construct, experienced and interpreted through language. One city with 3 names. Oh, and this is the book by Marion Hirsch and Leo Spitzer. And this will show you where Czernowitz is on this little corner called Bukovina. So on the very, very edge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and today in the very, very west part of Ukraine. Czernowitz. One city with three names, three different versions of a city. Each Czernowitz, the multicultural Habsburg city, the Romanian city between the two wars called Czernowitz, the city best known for its literary heritage, the home of Paul Celan, Aaron Appelfeld, and Rose Auslander, and the post-war Ukrainian city called Czernowitz is a variation on the theme. Advancing through states of translation, the city becomes a reproduction of itself, a replica which is both the same and different. Statues are replaced, the statue of Schiller gone, Kobylianska in his place. Buildings are repurposed, the synagogue turned into a movie theater, and new narratives are added to the strata of urban memory. Czernowitz is one example of the way we can talk about a translational city. One where, as a result of violent conflict, the soundscape is altered. The city is a movie that has been given a new soundtrack. The dubbed version comes with a disconnect between visuals and sound, and it takes time for the familiar synchronicity to be restored. Perhaps cities that have experienced such language remakes are condemned to a perpetual state of dissonance, where the built environment will never fully regain the status of an original. Language makeovers were a frequent occurrence in 20th century history, in particular after World War I, when multilingual imperial cities were reborn as national cities. Consider the city of Thessaloniki, an Ottoman city until 1912. In few cities can one see such a radical renewal of the city's identity and the realignment in parallel of both language and built heritage. The city was translated out of its cosmopolitanism in two ways. A great fire destroyed the city center in 1917 and allowed for the Haussmann-like imposition of a modern and rational city plan, as you see in this slide. At the same time, Thessaloniki's emancipation from the Ottoman Empire and its new Greek identity was forged through the population transfers, which saw hundreds of thousands of Christians from Asia Minor fill the city, taking the place of the thousands of Muslims who were forced to cross the Aegean into Turkey. The French urban planner Ernest Hébrard planned a grand new design in the Neo-Byzantine style as a celebration of the city's Byzantine past. The results have been called the first great work of European urban planning into the 20th century. And its goal was to impose the imprint of the new Greek state by eliminating all trace of histories which were no longer relevant. While selected Byzantine monuments were given prominence at the center of new large avenues, all signs of the densely packed Jewish quarters that had dominated the core of Ottoman Salonika were eliminated. Not even the layout of the streets today indicate where the numerous synagogues were once situated. The once polyglot city, where Turkish and Ladino were the most prominent languages, and where Greeks until 1913 had been a minority, was by 1928 almost entirely Greek-speaking. So these are the Neo-Byzantine buildings. So the Neo-Byzantine was to refer to a past before the Ottomans, because what was being replaced was the Ottoman past and celebrating a new Greek national identity. Though such violent language takeovers were widespread in Central Europe and the Levant in particular, though they are to some extent a feature of colonialism and post-colonialism, they remain exceptional in the language life of cities overall. All cities are multilingual. In fact, one could say that multilingualism is the very condition of cityness. If you have a monolingual city, it's not. Impossible. And most languages coexist, the exceptions would maintain the rule. If you can think of one, Sparta or something, it's because it's an artificial imposition. All cities are multilingual. Most often their languages coexist in uneasy tension, translation taking the form of displacements and connections across the city. Languages jostle on urban terrain, occupying public spaces, attaching themselves symbolically to sites and landmarks, influencing the creation of architectural form. This is the broader sense we can give to cities in translation, and the one that allows us to understand all cities as driven by translational forces. And so translation is not usually an event that takes place once and for all, but is best understood as a process, as an ongoing condition. I'm going to discuss two examples, Trieste and Montreal and their translators. But first, a clarification. What I'm calling the translational city is not a different animal from the multilingual city. It's a perspective, an angle of approach, which brings to light the movement, complexity, and texture in urban language life. Multilingualism points to pure diversity, the number of languages spoken, with no account taken of the relations of tension, interaction, rivalry, or convergence, indifference, or interference among them, or the particular spaces they occupy in the city. In the translational city, by contrast, languages connect as they move across space, are dominant in certain zones, less so in others. Border zones are scenes of especially intense interaction. Translation tracks language flows and interactions among variously entitled communities, those which have historic claims to the territory of the city, as well as those that seek to establish claims as migrants, exiles, or sojourners. The interplay of languages within the city contributes to its distinctive feel, its particular sensibility, to the ways in which knowledge in and of the city is shaped. This may seem like a truism, but in the abundant literature devoted to the city over the last decades, the many works of urban and cultural studies, beginning with Walter Benjamin and extending through Richard Sennett or Edward Soja or Alan Bloom and the many, many others that I'm sure you've heard of, this linguistic and oral aspect has been entirely neglected in favor of the visual. The city has been seen but not heard. Yet languages are not only part of the experiential feel of a city, they in turn become modes of representation of the city, what has been called the city text, poems and novels, essays and letters, paintings, films, the biographies of people connected to the city. In short, everything that constitutes the aura and myth of the city and helps preserve it in the cultural memory as a specific and unique entity. To read a city in one language is to know one city text, alongside fellow citizens who perhaps experience a different city text. How is it different to read New York in English or in Spanish? New Orleans in French, Johannesburg in English, Afrikaans, or Xhosa, Manila in Spanish or Tagalog. Acts of translation bring these texts into dialogue, allows them to enter into new conversations and frames of interpretation. Each city shapes its own patterns of circulation. But I'll argue that translational cities come in essentially two varieties. Cities where there's an undisputed major tongue in which all citizens of the city are obliged to function, one language which is the gateway to upward mobility, English, so English, not Spanish in Los Angeles, and the rarer cases in which two historically rooted language communities feel a sense of entitlement and lay claim to the territory of the city. This second kind of city I call a dual city. And colonial Calcutta, Trieste, Barcelona, Montreal all exemplify this duality. In these cities, language relationships are center stage. They dominate the city text, and so translation and translators play an especially important role in cultural history, as they move through the spaces of the city, carrying messages, marking urban spaces, and reinterpreting symbols. The city becomes a crossroads of codes, a place of double entendre, where collective language insecurities nourish a culture of doubt, where memories meet at odd angles. This makes the space of the dual city a particularly modern space, in the sense in which modernity is understood as an awareness of the plurality of meaning systems, a testing of the limits of expression, and the understanding of dissonance as productive force. Claudio Magris, the Italian essayist, has shown how this uncertainty has had a special role to play in the emergence of modernist culture in a city like Trieste, a city at the edge of everything, which became the very center of a sensibility shaped by a suspicion of absolute values. Trieste's most famous writer, Italo Svevo, is in many ways the exemplary translator, writing at the intersection of languages, creating at the uneasy crossroads between aesthetic traditions. So here, as an example, I'm going to talk briefly about the translational tensions, but also the creative potential of Trieste, a city which became Italian in 1918. And then I'm going to briefly mention Montreal, because I have a feeling that by that time there won't be too much time left. So my apologies for the brevity of these particular expositions. That has no particular role. It's just a picture I like. That's Montreal. That's the city covered by language. So, geography is laden with cultural meaning in Trieste. The city faces the sea, embedded in the coastal area that was once part of the Venetian sphere of influence, extending into Dalmatia, a zone of Italian culture. So I don't have a pointer, but that whole right-hand angle there is an area of Venetian culture. Behind the city rises the limestone cliffs of the Carso, the rugged terrain of the Slovene population, a zone of Slavic culture. But the city fathers of Trieste threw in their lot with a third cultural domain when, in order to escape the domination of the Venetians, they chose political subjection to Vienna in the 15th century. So, very briefly, for 400 years, Trieste was a historical anomaly, a city politically and economically Austrian, but culturally Italian. And Trieste is legendary for the rich literary culture it nourished, including writers James Joyce, Italo Svevo, and Umberto Saba. And I just saw a wonderful Tom Stoppard play called Travesties, which unfortunately takes place in Zurich. It should have taken place in Trieste, because it's about, if ever you should see it, it's a very good play. Zurich Between the Wars, in which James Joyce is a major character. Sorry to mention that. Language and language politics were crucial to the history of Trieste, as they were in all the Habsburg cities in the late 19th century. Until 1918, German was the expression of political and commercial authority, the language which every cultivated or ambitious Triestino would have to master. Slovene or Croatian was relegated to the marginal spaces of domestic and menial labor and under fascism literally forced underground. Tuscan was the language of a nation and culture which was being constructed throughout the 19th century as the lost motherland of the Triestines. And finally, Triestino, the local dialect, was the true language of everyday citizenship, the universally spoken vernacular uniting and welcoming the many immigrant populations of the 19th century. Now, the main point I want to make about Trieste is that while the city over the centuries had successfully resisted the efforts by Austria to impose German as the language policy in the city, Trieste indeed served as a gateway for the entry of German ideas and cultural forms into Italy. So that's the main point I want to make, and that's the duality I want to point to. The fact that Trieste is a language where Italian or Triestino is the daily language, but German is the language of culture because of this very strange relationship with this city had cultivated over 400 years, being a city situated in a kind of an Italian cultural zone, but whose cultural allegiance, his intellectual allegiance is largely or partly German. And I'll just get to the example then of Italo Svevo. Okay, this is the zone. Trieste was in such an in-between zone that from 1945 until 1953, it wasn't clear whether it would actually remain in Italy. And these zones were disputed zones until 1953. What is strange about Trieste is the particular dissonance between its architectural heritage, which is Habsburg, and its Triestine and Italian heritage. Though Italo Svevo is known as a novelist, I argue for Svevo as a translator, a mediator between the Italian and German cultural zones. Svevo's fiction. So Svevo is mostly best known for this particular novel called La Coscienza di Zeno in Italian and translated variously as The Confessions of Zeno, or more recently as The Conscience of Zeno. Two very different ideas. Svevo is also particularly well known. This is a poster that was on a wall in Trieste, and you'll notice the cigarette in his hand. And the opening chapters of the Confessions of Zeno, which is the title it's most known by, have to do with Zeno's last cigarette. So Zeno was always, the character called Zeno was always smoking his last cigarette. Always the last. It's kind of like the next or the last. I don't know grammatically what you would call that, but it can be always applied to the next. Endless deferral. So he never did give up smoking. He was always smoking his last cigarette. And then the next one was the last. And the next one was the last. So someone has put a cigarette in his hand. So the German language existed in Trieste more like a cultural and administrative overlay than as a resident tongue. Yet the cultural influence of German was pervasive by contrast with Slovene. And it's the paradox of this kind of distant proximity that makes the literary culture of Trieste a source of unending fascination, and which is most fruitfully explored through the inventions of a writer whose psyche reflected the complex divides of his city. Psychoanalysis and the influence of Freud were pervasive in Trieste in the 1920s and 1930s. The testimonies of many of the writers of the time make clear to what extent psychoanalysis was important. Many of the members of the Triestine intelligentsia were involved in translating Freud in one way or another. So here is where we get to the translation part. In fact, the psychoanalyst called Eduardo Weiss was actually the first translator of Freud into Italian. And psychoanalytic culture was much more active in Trieste. Well, it was non-existent in the rest of Italy. It was only in Trieste. So many of the members of the Triestine intelligentsia were involved in translating Freud or in one way or another. And what was particular about Svevo's approach to Freud is the following. Svevo half seriously, half playfully adopted the form of the psychoanalytic confession as the framing device of this novel, which was written in 1924, turning it to his own ends. Zeno, who is Svevo's character, is not a good patient and questions the competence of the analyst. And I'm just going to give one example to bring out to what extent psychoanalysis, translation, and the divides of Trieste are revealed in the novel. So this is what happens. Towards the end of the novel, okay, this novel, the framing device is that Zeno has written the novel for his psychoanalyst. The psychoanalyst says, write me an account of your problems. And Zeno grudgingly decides to do this. He's not very happy with doctors, and the psychoanalyst is a kind of a doctor, so he takes it on. Towards the end of the novel, after he's written his many chapters of stories of his last cigarette, which is always the last cigarette, and his marriage, and his business life, and his many turns of thought. Svevo's character Zeno confesses to his psychoanalyst that everything he has written in the novel is a lie. Why was it a lie? Because it was written in a foreign language, Tuscan. Triestino, says Zeno, is his real language. Tuscan is a formal and alien language for which he must have recourse to the dictionary. And as one naturally avoids the dictionary, Zeno explains, he has used only the words that came to him spontaneously, thus limiting the range of ideas and emotions he could discuss. The declaration has two effects. On the one hand, Zeno is undermining his testimony, questioning the truth of everything that he's written up to this point. He says, okay, I've told you all this, but really it's a lie. On the other hand, Zeno is also attempting to take control of the psychoanalytic process and prevent the doctor from producing an interpretation which would be authoritative. He says, you can't interpret this because it's not true. By undercutting his own testimony, Zeno is effectively trying to take over. And I quote, "The doctor puts too much faith in these damned confessions of mine, which he won't return to me so I can revise them. Good heavens, he studied only medicine, and therefore doesn't know what it means to write in Italian for those of us who speak the dialect and can't write it. A confession in writing is always a lie. With every Tuscan word, we lie." Is this a true declaration of linguistic incompetence or a typically perverse flourish on the part of an unreliable narrator and a recalcitrant patient? Svevo indeed had troubles with Tuscan, not only because of Triestino, but because he had received his education only in German and had taught himself literary Italian. So as a cultivated young Triestino, he would have learned German, he would have studied in German. Italian was only the language that you spoke on the street, or that you tried to cultivate as a literary person. Svevo's defiance of the doctor is in some ways a confession in itself. In order to produce literature, Svevo was obliged to translate himself. And indeed, to be a Triestine means that one is necessarily between languages. The linguistic inadequacies of the Triestines inevitably lead to such a result because, and I quote, "By predilection, we recount all the things for which we have words at hand. This is exactly how we choose from our life the episodes to underline. Obviously, our life would have an entirely different aspect if it were told in dialect." That's what he says. So, linguistic discomfort, the sense of being between languages, retroactively then suffuses the novel. Strata of language take the form of a palimpsest, reminiscent of Freud's own topography of the mind. The underground id is Triestino. The surface ego is Tuscan, and the superego is German. The linguistic ground of Trieste reveals itself to be a space of translation. The modern hero is not only, as it was said, politically useless, socially decadent, and psychologically anxious. The modern hero, as we see in Svevo, is also linguistically fractured. So the divides of Trieste, the linguistic divides, the triple division that we have, I mean, it could be quadruple as well, are perfectly represented in this novel, which is in fact one of the foundations of the Italian modernist novel, which is on the one hand an account of living in Trieste, but using this framing of a psychoanalytic session, was in fact the very first novel ever to use the device of psychoanalysis, right? And we're talking about 1924, I believe. So if the language divisions of Trieste are best represented by the model of the Freudian palimpsest, Montreal's are much more two-dimensional. A flat surface divided into two. So switching very briefly and very quickly to Montreal as a divided city. So Montreal was for much of its life a divided city, making it part of a series which includes the colonial segregated city on the one hand, Calcutta, Rabat, Dakar, Johannesburg, and the politically divided city on the other, Nicosia, Berlin, Gorizia, Mostar, Belfast, Jerusalem. As in these cities, the divisions have been tested and frayed, but also reinforced through acts of translation. So the history of Montreal since the 1960s and what is known as the Quiet Revolution has been one of progressive translation from English into French. This fact gives direction to Montreal's language shift, marking a similarity with cities which experienced language renaissance. The 19th century was particularly rich in movements of linguistic reclamation, which were intended to imprint cities with a new national identity. And these happened all over Europe and Barcelona and Calcutta. In the 1960s, Montreal's first skyscrapers were built, new bridges were constructed, and urban renewal bulldozed new neighborhoods. The city was a site of social turbulence, which would lead to what was called the Francophone reconquest of Montreal. The cultural forces at work in the city were best represented by the journal called Parti Pris, which cultivated an aggressive use of colloquial French. And narratives across the city were infused with a sensibility which looks like this. The divide across Montreal had something of the feeling of the gap that Doris Salcedo dug into the floor of the Tate Modern in London. She called her artwork shibboleth, the word that appears in the Bible as a magic code word which allows passage across a boundary. To pronounce the word correctly is to be allowed across. Gradually, from the 1960s on, Montreal shibboleth switched from English, the English of what had once been a dominant minority, to what was now the cultural and political authority of French. This is one of the classics of that period by Malcolm Reed. I want to just make a quick switch to the present. So if Montreal was so obsessed with French and English for so many years, I'm just going to sort of just make a slight deviation here towards the end and talk about what seems to me as a really interesting act of translation in Montreal recently. And that is the translation, which is this movie called Incendie. Have any of you seen it? Okay, so Incendie is a film made by Québécois Denis Villeneuve. Denis Villeneuve has now made some Hollywood films as well. And it's a translation of a play by Wajdi Mouawad, translated into English as scorched. Although it was called Incendie in the film. And this is a play by a francophone playwright of Lebanese origin, which was made into a film by Denis Villeneuve. So, just very briefly, what I want to say about this is that it's again another kind of translation, which shows that that English and French are no longer the only game in town in Montreal. Though this was for a very long time the dominant story of a city divided into two parts, where English and French were the two languages in conversation. There's conversations with other languages going on now, and in particular with Arabic, and what happened in this play by Denis Villeneuve. So you have a Québécois filmmaker who takes the play of this Lebanese playwright and transforms it himself into something which is a quite different kind of artifact. But I call it a translational artifact because he takes a product which is itself kind of something that was produced at the intersection of cultures, and he takes it one step further. There's a term that I've used, which is furthering, which is a kind of translation which takes a product and takes a cultural a film or a piece of writing and moves it one step further. So there are many things I could say about Montreal and the translational aspects, but maybe I'll just leave that for the discussion period. And I think I'll conclude saying that I began with the premise that all cities are translational, but some more than others. That some cities have an undisputed strong language. Others are afflicted or perhaps graced with linguistic insecurities. I would argue that Trieste, that Montreal are cities that have been obsessed with language and where language insecurities are very much a part of the city text, and that this has led to what I would call a kind of productive dissonance. So in some cities, processes of translation seem to have been dictated to a definitive end point, as I mentioned at the beginning. In others, translation will remain a very public and dramatic condition of existence. But maybe these distinctions are not as important as the observation that translational dynamics are at the core of all urban citizenship today. And so in the era of diasporas and globalization, it is translation that tells which languages count, which can generate the relationships at the base of a common urban citizenship. That's why I thought it was important to bring in the idea that in languages, in cities like Trieste and in Montreal today, we're no longer talking about only the dialogue between or among those traditional languages, the ones that have a kind of a historic right to the city, but new languages, certainly Arabic in Montreal and in Trieste, Chinese and Filipino, and all the languages of globalization, which are very active. So in the eras of diasporas and globalization, it is translation that tells which languages count, which can generate the relationships at the base of a common urban citizenship. It's not the simple presence of languages that matter, but the ways in which languages converge within public space to create a common place of conversation and debate, and the ways in which an enhanced role for the translator will contribute to this end. Thank you.
So
good amount of time for questions, and I hope that we can go off in all those areas that you're intrigued by. So anybody, the floor is open.
Brilliant talk. Anyway,
Oh.
fantastic. You're fantastic. I love your work. Always have. One thing that I keep on missing is the idea. Okay, so languages do interact, right? And that's the research I do. There is no mention of Indigenous language in Montreal. That would have been kind of nice. But that points to the fact that Indigenous languages continue to be almost non-existent. They are not languages of modernity when in fact they sort of are. And that brings me to my question. It's like, okay, so the quote that the Svevo quote is beautiful. It says, what was it? I have it right here, Mr. Svevo. There's the idea that it's the writing, right? A confession in writing is always a lie. And then that brings me to the one thing that you're leaving out is that those interactions, those multilingual interactions, those places where you can actually negotiate the meanings within the city happen in orality and do not happen to writing, because writing comes with the state-sponsored language, writing, violence, and so on and so forth. So my question is, where do you fit Indigenous languages in your research, and where do you fit orality within that?
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, Indigenous languages. Because my focus has been on specific symbolic spaces in the city. So in Montreal, those spaces that are culturally marked, symbolically marked, exclude Indigenous languages. So there's one spot in Montreal, which is the Belvedere that looks out over the city, which is now called Kondiaronk, and it has been named for the Indigenous leader who negotiated the peace of 1701, which is a very important peace treaty. So that's the only real symbolic place that where Indigenous languages are acknowledged in the city. And I realized that this was a major problem, and that I could say, okay, so Indigenous groups are not present in the city. I had once a very, very interesting remark on the part of a student I had. I was doing a seminar in a history of, in a humanities program, and this student, who is the daughter of a very prominent Indigenous Mohawk leader from Ganawage, she said, we come to Montreal to lose ourselves. So the places where they're culturally marked as Indigenous people were on these reserves outside of town, which you have to drive to and which have been, their areas separated out, and not in town. And only recently have they begun, for instance, a festival of Indigenous cinema in the city. So there's not, that presence, that physical presence, if we're looking at spaces, is lacking. All the same, I have become much more aware of it, and in fact, I'm going to be organizing a conference where I'm talking about new spaces and new diversities in Montreal, and I've invited some people, but I'm afraid that they are performance artists, and I'm afraid that all they're going to talk about is the lost traces, the absences. I'm happy that they're going to come, but I don't know how they're going to bring this into the discussion. But it's a very important aspect. As for orality, yes. I mean, translation happens orally, of course, but the translations that I talk about in my work are in directly in relation to Montreal or in relation to the other cities. They are written and they are intensely involved in the cultural life of the city because, as I said, the cultural text, that what is written about the city is the imaginary of the city. It founds the imaginary city. What are you thinking about as you walk down the street? You have books in your head, you have symbols, you have narratives, you have elements that have come from your reading, and those elements are very much, they're written and they very much feed into the imaginary of the city. So I don't think that what happens in the city is only oral. The translations, the way that translators move across the city, the way they bring narratives from one place to another, I mean, my favorite example, I guess, that I've given about Montreal in terms of a translator moving languages from one to another is the translator, a French-Canadian translator called Pierre Antil, who has translated the Yiddish language. So the Yiddish language used to live along that central area, because what's nice about Montreal is that it has it expresses a very elemental truth, right? These two warring communities within the middle for a very long time, this immigrant community that lived right in the center between the two. So that made for a very nice symbolic configuration. But the Jews who inhabited this central area moved out west, because that became to the western part. That was more modern, that's where you went. So Yiddish as a language disappeared from the center of the city and mainly inhabited the western areas. But this French-Canadian translator who translated Yiddish into French in a very symbolic but in a very real way, brought that language back to the center and even to the east end of the city. So moved the language across the city, made it exist in places that it hadn't been. So I think that there's both, I think that written translation also very much belongs to the language life of the city. That is Rue Saint-Laurent, right. It's an ancient city. It's an old map, and it's one of the first streets in the history of the city. The city starts at the port, and Saint-Laurent was established in sort of the early 1800s as the old town. The walls of the old town came down, and the city starts to move northwards, and it moves along that street. The other interesting thing about that street is that Montrealers think that it goes north-south because they're called north-south, but in fact it heads. I can't tell from that, but I guess it heads westward, because in the summer you have the sun setting right at the top, so that's got to be the west. So it heads westward rather than north-south. So everything's off kilter. It's very nice. Everything is out of sync, right? Things are not what they seem, right? Languages are wrong. Places are misnamed.
I had a question. Your work reminds me of, and this is maybe a text you reference too, but Michel de Soto's Walking the City.
Yes.
And there's, I was thinking a little bit about how the alliance of city and concept, in this case translation, is also, in some cases, that alliance itself kind of refers in some ways to city planning. And I'm curious if, I have a quote from Sartre that I don't carry around with me, I just happen to have in my notebook. But he says, the alliance of city and concept is both to give thought to the real and make effective the notion of the plural. And he kind of goes on to talk about sort of the politics of space and language. And I know a lot has been written, especially after the student protests, about how cities are constructed, how spaces become political. And I'm really interested in how this theory of translation is also connected to these sort of political spaces and how we think of translation in those contexts as well. I'm just curious if you could elaborate on that.
Okay, that's sort of open. I'm not quite sure exactly
how.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just thinking about how space figures perhaps more actively into your work. I mean, you're talking about urban environments which are shaped and reshaped for various reasons and are constructed for political reasons as well. And I'm just curious, I guess, how space is, more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, de Certeau very nicely. There's a very nice quote about him talking about translators as mediators in the city, and how I think that's really a very good insight that he had about actually placing translators in the spaces of the city and seeing them as mediators, as carrying messages. And I think that's really interesting for us, is to think of how translational activities are in space. one really interesting thing about working on the city and seeing how spaces interact is that you can see the simultaneity of spaces. Maybe that's just sort of one tack I can take to answer that. What is fascinating is that Montreal was, just to use this particular example, and because space is so politically and socially connoted in Montreal, that's, I haven't, the best analog to Montreal that I have is the actual colonial city, like Calcutta. Somebody once, I said that Montreal was Calcutta, and she said, "Oh, you're trivializing Calcutta. You don't understand that." No, Montreal is like Calcutta. It's exactly like Calcutta. This is not. They were actually built around the same time. They're the product of the same historical forces, and they were built on the same model of sort of black town, white town. In Calcutta, it's called black town, white town. It's still referred to that in a certain way, although, of course, Calcutta has changed immensely because Calcutta, India, went through a process of independence, and the city has been Bengalized. The whole city is now one sort of united city, but there's certainly spaces that are still connoted as colonial spaces. So Montreal is very much a colonial city, right? The natives, who weren't the first natives, but the second natives, or the French Canadians who lived in the east side, and then the western side was sort of the British colonial spaces. So that, spaces take on such a stark political importance because it's very easy to situate spaces on that political spectrum. Now things have changed. And those divisions are really falling more and more into disuse, and new kinds of spaces are being invented, and new myths are being invented, although the old ones die hard. What was really interesting for me, though, just to look at it, to take the perspective of the city, was to notice, and then to see, although I certainly wasn't the first, that in the 1940s there were three separate modernist literary movements in Montreal, in English, in French, and in Yiddish, and nobody had ever really talked about those three together, because each one belonged to a separate national history. So languages are so quickly inserted into national histories. And it's as if it's impossible to talk about literary relations that aren't kind of nationally based. So the city has that very nice way of allowing, when you look at actual spaces, you can see things differently. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about Trieste. You said it faced the sea. Does that mean it's a port?
Yes,
okay.
Very much a port, and we have among us the writer of a book on Trieste, the port city.
Well, my apologies. That relates to my actual question.
I made.
So you said that Triestino was the dialect spoken in the
Yes.
States, and it sounds like it's at least vaguely related to. Well, okay. My question is, how did trade and the influence of other trading empires and countries affect both the dialect and the translation of dialect? Because, different words would mean different things in the different languages that are coming into the city. And so I'm just wondering how the cities chose dialect of absorbed trade words and that just fell into language. How did that affect translation?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know if Lois, you could answer that question, but Triestino, Trieste was known as an emporium. It was a great trade city. Lots of people came, lots of immigrants came to Trieste during the 19th century, and Triestino is a city, is a language that absorbed a lot of other words. I don't know Triestino, but James Joyce did. And it was the language of James Joyce at home. And in fact, his children, Giorgio and Lucia, spoke Triestino as their first language. And John McCourt, who has written a marvelous, marvelous book about Joyce's years in Trieste, called The Years of Bloom, because Joyce lived in Trieste for, I forget, 9 or 12 or something years. Claims that Triestino may have been, even probably was, the source for Finnegan's Wake. For this is sort of he says that Finnegan's Wake was an exploded Triestino. And language was also a lot of fun in Trieste. McCourt points to magazines that were written in, what he says, sort of Frenchified Italian or Italianized German, or there was a lot of crossing. Of course, as in any language situation where there's a lot of contact, a great deal of effort is turned into separating languages and trying to make them pure. And in fact, Svevo, not in this novel, but in the novel called Una Vita, talks about his character going to the library and reading the 19th century Rossetti, I think his name was Domenico Rossetti, who was they were very philologically oriented, and they were going back to the origins of Italian and making sure that they spoke correct Italian with the right pedigree. So there was a lot of, every time you have contact, you have the other thing too. People being very sure that they speak the other languages properly and protecting it, as you see in Montreal as well, as you see in any of these cities. In Barcelona, very much the same thing, right? As dangerous as it is for these languages to enter into contact, so you have institutions and academies and and groups and writers' unions being very, very busy setting up their own autonomous institutions and speaking the very best versions of their language, so there won't be interaction. So there's always a bit of both, sort of an answer, as much as there is the frottement and the interference, then you have this mania for separating out. Yeah?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, the trading networks were partly with the rest of the Italian peninsula, the entire Eastern Mediterranean and the Ottoman Empire, with Western Europe, the New World, even the Far East. So not each of those really became reflected, I would say, as languages of power. But I mean, this dialectic between having to know several languages, but knowing each one well, and then... Or
usually knowing one well,
Well, Svevo wrote that every businessman in Trieste really ought to know 4 languages. And I assume he meant German and Italian.
Yeah.
And probably English and French is my guess. I don't think he meant Ladino or any other language.
Right.
I can think of.
Well, especially if you were working in correspondence in the bank, which he did,
Yeah.
and which is character, where you had to write letters to asking for credit, and
So
then it
in
would
other
be.
words, I'm not a student of language, so I can't get into the nitty gritty. But there's the mixture, I think, would be in one level of language, and the fun and the play and maybe daily speech, but commercial correspondence.
Right,
culture,
gotta get it right.
As you said, the separation.
You got to get it right. Yeah.
Quality
Yeah.
is important.
Trieste was the city you left for if you were going to Palestine. The Lloyds of the big ships would leave from Trieste to Palestine, and the Lloyd the ships would actually produce their multilingual magazines for the ships' passengers to read, and those were produced in Trieste too. So there's a lot of language stuff going on.
And I should just add that earlier Greek was important.
Yes, yes.
Without fading.
Thanks.
So I was going to ask, and I thought it was interesting that your presentation ends on the note of talking about sort of a more expansive transitional culture in Montreal. Interesting, especially because as you walked in, the text being read was a Bolivian-born Canadian writer living in Montreal that had been translated from Spanish into English and then read down here. And so I thought it was an interesting coincidence of events. In any case, Spanish, no doubt, I think plays an enormous role in the transitional culture of Montreal, and I don't read in your work much mention of that, and I'm curious, so seeing as if your research is expanding towards considering a more expansive view of that transitional culture, in what capacity Quebec's relationship with Latin America, and specifically, I think Quebec's openness to Latin American immigrants to the province at large, and specifically to Montreal, relates to a renovation of this transitional culture, and whether it's something that you've thought about.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, certainly Quebec has a lot of Latin American immigrants. Quebec played a very important role in 1973, the Chilean debacle, where a lot of Chileans came to Montreal and were very active in the cultural scene. So Spanish is probably the language you hear most on the street after English and French. Now, I guess certainly these are important cultures and are increasingly important. The trouble with a dual city like Montreal or like Barcelona or like Calcutta in the 19th century, as I mentioned, is this kind of obsessional duality where these two communities on their own territory kind of can't, you just sort of go at it, you know? And they each have their own narratives. They each consider themselves to be entitled to that space. And they each have their own narratives. And they judge newcomers on whether they're going to take the right side, right? So immigrants, unfortunately, haven't been courted quite actively enough by the Parti Québécois, for instance, or by the Nationalist Party. But you know, for a long time, I don't know if you're familiar. Why would you be? We had a major referendum in 1995, and the Nationalist Sovereigntist Party lost by a very small percentage, and the head of that Nationalist Party on the night of the election, having lost the election, his comment to the world was, "We lost because of the ethnics."
He said the Jews and the immigrants.
Right.
He didn't say the Jews, but you know, he might have. He said money and l'argent et les groupes ethniques, or l'argent, money. Well, maybe that's code, you know, and ethnic groups. But so that was really, really, really unfortunate. But it illustrates something, and just not to. I'm not telling this story just to talk about sort of our local politics, but it illustrates the difficulty in all of these cities. And Barcelona is a very interesting example, where you have the same kinds of tension. And in fact, there's a very, very interesting novel by a Moroccan woman called Najat El Hashmi, called where she's written a couple of novels in Catalan, right? Which again is kind of the equivalent of French in sort of aligning herself with the Catalans rather than the more powerful Spanish, more powerful on some levels, not on others. So in these embattled cities, typically it's more difficult for third, fourth, fifth groups to kind of make their way, to negotiate their way into the histories, to align themselves, to translate themselves into the narrative in a certain way. And even though these, these Latin American groups are very numerous and they have very active literary scenes, I think the type of translation is still limited in its impact and in its power.
Can I sort of ask the opposite question? What do you see the role? I'm thinking of cities like Kiev, between Ukrainian and Russian, Kishinev in Moldova, between Russian and Romanian, where you have global English sort of inserting itself into those language politics. What sort of space do you see that creating, or how does global English sort of blow apart these dualities?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, your question supposes the answer that it does, and that it's having a great deal of influence. And so these are things to sort of explore and figure out how it works. I mean, I think that in Barcelona, for instance, English is moving into that kind of a space, and I mean, it's different in Montreal because English is already one of the languages. But one of the funny things about Montreal is that how to say this? I sort of said it in a kind of in a joke sort of way that there are two kinds of English in Montreal, and you have to know which one is being spoken when. And one kind of English is the historic language of the English language community in Montreal, something like the historic language of the English community in Ireland, or the historic language of the, that community which has been there, which has its rights, which has been struggling and battling for its institutions and that kind of. And you have another language which is international English. And that English is completely different, doesn't have any kind of stress involved. It's not trying to protect anything. It's not trying to, just kind of there. But for Francophone, they don't, I mean, in terms of the traditional politics, those two tend to get conflated. So that's a problem. But international English is a new being, and I'm not sure what its impact is. I mean, what can you tell me about Kiev or?
Well, the case I would know better is Kishinev in Moldova.
Okay.
Where you have these two groups that the sort of Russian was dominant in the Soviet period, but now you have two groups that have a very unbalanced bilingualism. Some people are totally bilingual and some people are totally unilingual. Unilingual in terms of the two dominant languages, but everybody is starting that everybody's knowing some English.
Right.
And so English is the access to power. So instead of learning Romanian, which is the state language, instead of learning Russian, which is the traditional language of power, people are attracted to English.
But I guess that it comes down to a question of institutions, right? Because the dominant institutions in these places will always be, they'll be Russian and, there'll be Romanian, and you won't have the same kind of, the writing community won't write in English, or will they? I guess that's one of the very interesting distinctions between Barcelona, for instance, and in Montreal. In Barcelona, writers write in both languages. They won't always write the same things, but they write in both languages. And writers are kind of the important example, I think, because literature is the enshrinement of the language and its highest, I guess, cultural manifestation. So writers write in different ones. In English, in Montreal, no. And I try to kind of figure that out. How has that persisted? That you affiliate yourself, you're a member of one club and you cannot join the other. That has to do with ideas of, I couldn't possibly write in English because it's too hard, because, to be a real writer I have to write in only one language, because it's, to be, masterful, exponent of the language, I must be only writing one But in North America, probably I would say that that kind of plurilingual. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah.
I was just going to make a comment on that the Latino Canadian community, or at least the writers I'm aware of in Montreal, do write sometimes in both languages, in both, in addition to the original Spanish, they will write.
Right.
Are starting to write.
Right.
In English and in French, and some have chosen one or the other. Some write it both. So
Oh, that's
it's an
interesting.
interesting thing that's happening.
Yeah. Yeah, that's. I mean, that the fact that they write also in English or in French, but between the writers who are part of just English or French, there isn't that kind of crossover. So could English become a literary language in Moldova? Probably not. Yeah.
I'm interested in translators as activists and activist translation, and I wonder if, like, given the asymmetries of power, even in dual cities, the power between the two languages is not equal. Are different translation strategies adopted, working, say, from French to English versus from English to French, and are they taught differently? Is translation pedagogy approached differently, in terms of like domesticating versus foreignizing and these other things that we talk about in translation theory?
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I'm not sure how to. Activist translation is a big deal now. It's very interesting in Quebec. It's become more so, especially in relation to the student strikes 2 years ago. A collective was formed called Translating the Printemps Érable, which was the Maple Spring, which was what the student strikes were called. And this collective has attracted quite a bit of interest and attention. I notice my students are doing research projects now on sort of crowdsourcing and volunteer translating. I find this very interesting kind of a phenomenon, kind of a taboo topic. Volunteer translating. No, you can't translate until you have a degree, and you have but now everybody. Oh, sure you can if you get online and volunteer translate, and as a kind of an emancipatory gesture, but can you do it right? It's it's an interesting new development in translation, I find. I think the big difference between the directions is a question of the defense of the language and making sure you. French is so obsessed with defending itself, with not being interfered with not being tampered with, contaminated by English, that there's a great deal of effort in translation pedagogy just devoted to making sure you're not making mistakes that have to do with language contact. So that's people who write in French are overzealous. Translators into French have become known as sort of monitors, moniteurs. They're watching to make sure that you get it right. I've become like that too. It's not. You're just always watching for that encroachment of English and make sure that you're not saying something because it's that kind of interference. So that's important. Now, on the larger cultural levels, there have been really very different schools of thought on that. For a very long time, translation of Quebec literature into English was more of an ethnographic venture. You wanted to make sure that the realities of Quebec and the difference of Quebec was adequately rendered, therefore a much more foreignizing kind of translation happening between French and English. And that was a really recognizable tendency in the up until at least, I mean, maybe it's still going. It had to do with the fact also that a lot of Quebec literature was written in a recognizable variety of French, which again you wanted to reflect in the English. So more use of French words or kept in the English. There were quite a few novels of the 1960s and 70s whose titles were kept in Prochain épisode by Hubert Aquin, famous novel. It's called in English, Prochain épisode. I don't know how that helps for people who don't speak French, but that's the way it was. And that was reflected in in a very long tradition of trying to respect the cultural specificity of Quebec. On the other hand, translating from English into French was there was no cultural specificity to respect. Ho ho. That's not just that's. It was a lot less of a concern. So, and the French tradition being, as we know, a much more, one that puts much more emphasis on the quality of language and is less tolerant of interferences. So the tradition would have been more fluid or domesticating, for sure. And there's some notorious examples, by the way, some really good ones. Any of you heard of Mordecai Richler? So Mordecai Richler is, well, he's a writer we love to hate. He's a very grumpy, obstreperous kind of writer who was, but a wonderful novelist. And his last novel was called, they made a movie, it's a terrible movie, Barney's Version. And the French was full of mistakes. So one of the mistakes everybody loves to point to is, so we have a hockey tournament every year, and if you win the hockey tournament, you get the Stanley Cup. So it was translated as the Tasse de Stanley. So it was a translation done in France, I should say that. So there are a lot of translations done in France of stuff from English Canada, and they so who cares? I've never been there. I don't know the difference. So why should anybody care? So that translation lasted for a long time. It was in the stores for years and years and years, more than 15 years. It's only being retranslated now. It was full of howlers, published by Albin Michel, by a very well-known French translator. So that wouldn't happen if it had been translated in Quebec. However, there's more of a tendency in French to sort of make things sound like they should, rather than try to figure out what is the real story on the ground. That's just a little anti-French thing.
That seems like a good place to stop.